Okay, let's get started. Welcome everyone to the sensitivity labels for Teams, Office 365 groups, and SharePoint sites webinars. My name is Vlad Catrinescu. I'll be your host. And before we get started, let me just talk a bit about some of the housekeeping items. First of all, this webinar will be recorded. So if you ever want to share the recording after with your friends or come back to it, it will be sent to you within 48 hours by email. The slides will also be shared. So if you ever want to reference them or again share them with friends or colleagues, all of this will be shared to you by email within 48 hours. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by my co-host, Drew Madelung. How are you doing, Drew?
Very good today, Vlad. Excited for this one. So,
Awesome. I,
yes.
I know compliance and security has been one of your most exciting topics for about a year now. So I'm sure you're very excited about this one. And we also got an amazing special guest today, Sanjoyan Mustafi, Senior Program Manager at Microsoft. How are you doing, Sanjoyan?
Hey, thanks, Vlad, for inviting me. Doing good. Thank you.
Hey, Sanjoyan, can you please introduce yourself? I'm sure many people have seen you speak or even do a bunch of blogs and podcasts, but for those of you who don't know you, can you do a quick introduction?
Yes. So myself, Sanjoyan Mustafi, as Vlad mentioned, Senior Program Manager working with Microsoft for 14 years now. SharePoint and OneDrive security and compliance is not only my specialty, but passion as well. So you can come and join me in LinkedIn and ask me any questions about anything that has to do with security and compliance with SharePoint. I specialize in sensitivity label. We will talk more about that both for Teams, Office 365 groups, SharePoint sites, also for documents, advanced compliance and security features like conditional access, multi-factor authentication, and much more.
That is,
And yeah, I think this is such a good topic that when it kind of came up and we had the opportunity to talk about this, again, in this series, we're really trying to make sure we highlight some of the newer functionality. And Vlad, as you said, I have been working in the compliance space and in the security space for a while now. I'm a consultant, and a lot of my customers are in regulated industries. And whether it's financials or utilities or government, a lot of my work has been in this space, and uh, having to comply with whether specific regulations or global privacy concerns, or how you work with regulations that are given to you from all different jurisdictions. And those are leading into how can you make sure that your data, your files stay secure. So I think one of the transitions that I've started to see happen has obviously we've seen the transformation happen globally in the last 3 months. The market we're in, the way that we're in, working working remotely. I've had multiple customers approach me and say, how can I enable Teams, enable SharePoint, and start moving it away from the barriers of, let's say, firewall, right, or location. So a lot of the controls and security that I saw in the marketplace was with people saying, if I'm in the office, that's when I can access my content, and I can't, and it's secure because I can't get it anywhere else. But that very quickly changed in the aspect of in the last couple of months, and being able to secure content at the file level, regardless of where you're accessing your content, has become more of a mandate, regardless of your industry that you're in. So I think in talking through this and kind of to set the picture for me for how this goes is the need for sensitivity labels has never been greater. It was originally really thought of to me in more of a compliance and regulated space, but seeing the work that was there done, that was there now, I've worked with a lot of customers that had this in for a long time. Everyone else is now starting to take advantage of and realize that this functionality is incredibly helpful. And the feature sets that we're seeing here that Sanjaya is going to walk us through are critical to make to bring the use cases together, right? To bring in the day-to-day users and the experiences kind of outside of just in a technical term, but also bring them into front-facing for the end users wherever they're at. So I think from a customer side, it's interesting to see this really grow.
If you're not sold on the need for it after listening to Drew and his passion for them right now, I don't even know what else to say.
Yeah, I think the cool, Vlad, I know you and I go back on the group side for a long time in kind of where those came from. And it's been, I think one of the fun things for this is seeing the transition for the classifications and that it did exist, and in having conversations with customers and with Microsoft on what's the future of those, right? We've had those classifications in for years, but what are we going to do with them? How do we take advantage of them? And how do you make them smart? And the shift of those into sensitivity gives us that opportunity. So really I think a cool step is going to be evolving that in the journey to make your content more secure.
Awesome. I think Sanjoyan, take it away. And a small reminder for everybody, I forgot to say it in the housekeeping, my bad. You don't get the chance every day to have a senior program manager at Microsoft, especially with the experience of Sanjoyan in a webinar. So if you have any questions, please ask them during the webinar. We really want to get all of your questions around sensitivity labels answered. So you have a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Please use it for any questions that you might have. And with this, Sanjoyan, floor is yours.
Thanks, Vlad, and thanks, Drew, for this wonderful introduction. Vlad, since I'm sharing my screen, I'll not be able to look at the Q&A, so
we'll take care of that for you. Don't worry.
Yep. Okay, cool. So jumping in, the agenda for today is very simple. We will talk all about sensitivity labels that applies to teams, groups, and sites, how admins set it up, and then what are the different policies involved. And then we will do a side-by-side of what are the policies that admin will set and what is the implication to the end user. I'm trying to do, a side-by-side for each policies. And then we'll talk a little bit about what is in for developers. This is what I do not talk every day, but I get questions always that, hey, from a development standpoint, can we set labels using APIs and whatnot we can do and things like that? What are the precautions that we should take as developers working with SharePoint or groups and things like that? The other thing that we'll cover, which is a very critical item when people are migrating from, as Drew mentioned, from the classic AD classification, which was always there for several years that you could have applied to groups, to sensitivity label, which is labels with meanings, labels with actions, labels with policies. To that world, then what kind of precautions that you need to take, what kind of planning that you should have, because over the period of several years, you might already have a lot of groups that you have created with the old label. What about those? What about new ones? What about existing workloads like Teams, SharePoint, Outlook, and how about newer workloads like Yammer, Planner, Project? So we'll talk in details on those and what is recommendation from us. And finally, we will talk about the roadmap. This item has been in preview for some time. When are we GAing? And then what are the newer things that we are considering for the rest of the year? So please be there till the end. And there are some interesting roadmap items that are going to come up, and we'll talk about that. And of course, we'll take your questions. With that, let me start with the first part. And this is a demo heavy session. So, we will do as much demo, and my slides are not too PPT-ish, I should say. So let me bring up my first screen where I'm going to show you as an admin, how do you create labels? What are the different policies specific to team sites and groups? And then what are the implications? I hope everybody can see my screen. Quick check, Drew, you can see my screen, right?
Yes,
yep,
I
great.
can. You're in the Security and Compliance Admin Center right now.
Thank you. Thanks, Vlad. So this is where our journey starts. And probably some of you are already aware that classification labels has been there for some time. We made the transition for sensitivity specifically for documents. You may or may not have already experienced how to apply sensitivity label with documents, but today's talk is mostly about sensitivity labels for sites and groups. So let me show you what is special for sensitivity label for sites and groups. I'll use some of my existing labels that I've already created to save time. So I have labels such as general, confidential, and top secret. I'm going to use mostly these. And I've created one called finance department, and I'm going to talk what's special about that. So let's open up general. A label has several actions, as we call. So this is a summary view. When you go to the edit level view, you get to see standard operations, label name, label description that we apply. This specific label has no encryption action, so I'll just move on because I wanted to concentrate specifically on sites and groups. So the tab that if you haven't seen earlier, but you should see now, is the new tab called sites and group settings. We should ideally call team, sites, and group settings. We are going to a UX transition where the heading is going to change, which it should say teams, sites, and group settings. Okay. There are three basic policies that we are covering as part of these. The first one is privacy. And if you are aware of Office 365 groups capability, you will already know what does public and private mean. But very quickly, if your group, Office 365 group or team is marked as private, then only members can access the site or the team. In order to access that specific site, which is our team, which is marked as private, you need permission from the group admin to add you as part of that group, or else you can't. Versus public is within your organization, anybody can see, with some limitation, but basically anybody can see. And then there is an additional option called none. And this is a very critical one. Probably you haven't seen it earlier, or you may have. But while setting up a label, this is an additional option we provided to the admin, because at some time, admin may or may not want to choose the privacy on behalf of your end user. The privacy is public or private that the end users want to choose, and not the admin. So in those kind of scenarios where admin do not want to govern the privacy setting, then admin can choose none, and then the end user will be able to choose whatever he or she wants to for that business scenario. So with that, let me quickly switch to the SharePoint view to show you the impact of just the privacy setting. Okay, so my SharePoint homepage, not pretty, but working. Let me create a team site and say, okay. So I see the new sensitivity drop down here. If you haven't seen earlier, we also have the eye icon. If you click, it shows you the tooltip. We do recommend, to have enough verbose tooltip so that your user understands the usage of your labels. The one that is called general is my default label, so it is pre-selected. Do note that the privacy setting is available for the end user, that is me, to make a choice. So I can choose between public or private. If I switch my privacy settings to, for example, confidential, if you notice the privacy setting is now grayed out and it is called private. Because if you choose a confidential team or site, then my admin, based on my organization's policy, want to ensure that it becomes private. So if you notice with sensitivity label, the paradigm is changing. The paradigm is that we as an admin will create the right hooks and knobs and then provide the ability to our end user, because really when my end user is creating a team, he or she knows on what context that team is going to get used, or the site is going to get used, what kind of documents they're going to get uploaded, not the admin, because that is more of a reactive than proactive. So general, I made it none in the definition, so I can choose. If I would have made it public, then I could have pre-selected and it should have been disabled. If I choose confidential or top secret, then it becomes private. Okay, so that's the implication of the first one. And then similar experience in Teams, if I can quickly take you to Teams as well, because the story is seamless. across Office 365 workloads. So anywhere you are going to create a group, a team is also a group connected. So whenever you're going to create something, you will be prompted to choose a label. If you choose the right label, the right actions will be centrally enforced. Okay, so let me go ahead and create a team. Sometimes this is taking time. So let's see, build from scratch. While this is coming up, let me show you the second one. The second one is external user access. And this means that as an admin, I want to ensure that my Office 365 group owners may or may not add people who are outside my organizations. Popularly, we call guest users. So if I uncheck this, so it's not checked, it's unchecked, which means I do not want, whenever this label is applied to a site or a team or a group, then people who are outside my organizations, even the owner of the group, will not be able to add those people to the group. So, I can dictate that using this. Let me see, this has come up. So if you see, just trying to close the story for the previous one. So general, you can choose between public and private, versus if you choose confidential, that's the only option that is open to you, which is private, and you select and then you give a name to your team and you go ahead and create the team. So again, what I want to show is a seamless experience all around. The last one is for unmanaged device access. And if you're not familiar with AD, conditional access policy, we leverage and work very closely with Azure Active Directory conditional access policy to leverage such functionality and build it in within, specifically within SharePoint. So this control is more oriented towards SharePoint, where we say, hey, if the user is coming from an unmanaged device, and how do we know, like SharePoint know that it's an unmanaged device? Because we can, we talk to AD behind the scene when you sign in, and there's some information that we capture at sign-in time. And so we have those exchange and conversation with AD behind the scenes. So we know that when the request comes to SharePoint at that point in time, whether you are coming from a device which is managed versus which is not managed. If you have Intune or Ironmobile or something like that, which any device management tool that AD can talk with. And the three operations that we provide are allow full access. So this is like a regular access, unrestricted full access to SharePoint and Teams. The second one is allow limited access. This is an interesting one where we say, hey, you will be able to, go to SharePoint, browse SharePoint, open the documents in Office Online and be productive. You can upload documents, but you cannot download documents. So it prevents you from downloading content from devices that the organization do not trust, but still making you productive because probably you want to do a quick reading of a document from your phone, but the phone is your own and not provided by a company. It just gives peace of mind to the admin that you download a content and you forget, and if your device is compromised or if you're using a shared device, then the document can go to somebody else's hand, which is not intended. The last one is block access, and I'll show a demo of each one of them. So the last one is block access. So block access is like, hey, this is a super important and business critical site, and we do not want by intent or by mistake contents from this site to be leaked if you are accessing from an unmanaged device totally. And that's the setting that we recommend admins to choose if such teams or site needs to be protected. So block access. So so these are the three top level settings, and I'll show a demo of each one of them real quick. I have three labels. So the first one was general. The second one is confidential. If you see inside confidential, I'll show you the settings before showing the demo. So confidential has allow limited web only access. And then I have my last one, which is top secret. So if I go to sites and group settings, it's block access. Okay. So these are the three variations that I have. Okay, so let's see the impact of that for SharePoint sites and teams. So
while you're pulling this up, Sanjay, I want to put a little caveat here, because I think what I was referring to kind of front is so important here. So what I've been seeing is companies that would have basically block access everywhere, right? Like just the assumption of block access. And I like in thinking about this, and I mean it not in the way of using this functionality. They don't allow that functionality because they couldn't control it by device. So because what we have is you have to block everything, right? So the scenario would be customers saying, yes, maybe 95% of my SharePoint sites, they're fine to be accessed externally, but we can't necessarily put our controls in at the endpoint to get access to that or to control that. So if you go home and you want to access your work, there was not a trust between an organization and their employee, because we couldn't say that you could do whatever you wanted if we allowed access at that point, right? You still have identity to get in, but I still saw a lot of customers just kind of stopping and saying, well, no, you have to be on network to get access to this. Well, instead, what you can look at now is, if you have content that people need to work with wherever they are, you can empower the users to figure out and manage that. So if they classified a site as something that was more secure, that you as your organization define, you can say, that's fine. We need you to make sure we have control over that. But if you create a site for a team for your running league or for your running team, like for the company, like there's no reason you can't access that from home. You're not going to do anything malicious. So I think in context of that, that's where the conversation I'm having with customers now is, how can when we flip to this, how can we take that functionality and say, allowing people even on managed devices to access information, and even if you're on unmanaged, here are the granular controls that you can put in place now.
Excellent point, Drew. And then, what Drew mentioned, I'll just, reinforce that by telling that he mentioned a very important point. There may be thousands of sites in your company, okay? And then not all sites are of equal sensitivity. Some sites are probably, available, and you might want your employees to access those sites from everywhere, versus some sites have real, important special data that you want to protect and not let it out. Previously, we did not have this construct where you can manage that at a granular level of a site or a team. The block was like, hey, I will block entire SharePoint, and now you just can't access SharePoint from home, as Drew mentioned. Versus now, you pick and choose, and your business scenarios and apply the labels, and then correspondingly, all the actions or security policies follow only for that site or team. So that's the important piece, as Drew mentioned. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mark this as confidential, the specific site. So it will make it private, definitely. And behind the scenes, as I showed you, for confidential label, the settings is, cancel out just so that everybody can see what is the setting for. Confidential, it says allow limited web only access. Okay. So let's see what is the impact of that real quick. So as soon as the site gets created, we will browse to the site, and you will see, if you are not familiar previously, you will see the yellow bar coming in top. Oh, there is some glitch in my system. So let me show you the site that I already created, because I'm using a dev box and not always. Yeah. So, so this is a different label, but had the same settings. If I zoom into the settings, it says your organization doesn't allow you to download, print, or sync from this device. Okay, and this is the critical piece, which makes sure that if you are selecting a document, let's say you select this document, you can open the document. So document opens are fine, but if you select this document, you do not see a download link anywhere. There is no download link to download the document. You cannot sync the document, you cannot print the document. If I go to this window, if I go to the file tab, so you can edit the document, you see the same yellow bar experience. If you click, so there is no save as option, there is no print option. We disable all those options. Sorry.
So when people are kind of looking at empowering remote workforce like we are today, you could, if people have content, and maybe a lot of people might not have a really robust VPN structure for working from home. And this was an option to say, if you have content and you go through the process of classifying your sites, you could actually say, you can access all your stuff from home, from your home computer. You can work, you can access your files, but we don't want you to download to your machine, but you can still continue your work, and we don't have to necessarily provide you a device or a VPN setup on your home machine.
That is right. And just to finish this part of my demo, I'll take you to Outlook to show that the experience of group creation with sensitivity labels is seamless. So you can get the same experience if Outlook is your choice of, or OR rather is your choice of creation of groups. So if you come to OR as well, you see that you have the option to choose the sensitivity label here as well. The pre-selected sensitivity label, or the default label as we speak, is general. The privacy dropdown is still available, but if we shift to my confidential label, you see there is no privacy dropdown anymore. It makes the group that I haven't created yet to be private, and it says no guest. So it stops the owner from adding guest. Again, what I want to show is the experience is seamless for groups or teams across Office 365, across multiple workloads, SharePoint teams, and Outlook being the primary workload. Okay, so one quick thing before we end is you can do the same kind of audience targeting for labels. So for labels that applies to teams, sites, and groups, you can say that, hey, I have created this special label called finance, and I want only people from my finance department to get a view of this label, and not everyone should be able to get rid of this label. So this is a simple label I just created for demo purposes called finance department only. What I did is, if I go to label policies, and you might be already familiar with publishing of labels, if I show this label to you, the publishing policy, I just selected only 2% for this. So I selected Ted and John from my demo tenant to be part of this label. So now if I go to SharePoint homepage and try to create a site. So I am an admin persona. If you see, I was not part of the publishing policy of the label. If I create the site, just for now, you see the finance label doesn't show up here. Okay, so this is a cool thing where if I show you my Ted persona, so this is Ted, and he is from finance department, and I want to create a site. So you see the finance department only label shows up here. So again, similar experience if you're already experienced with sensitivity label, that you can target your audience, you can create labels with specific policy combinations and give it to your HR department, or even I have a lot of customers who build labels for specific projects and give it out for those people working in those projects, and only they can see the label. In my company, Microsoft, we have several labels that are available, but I can see only like 8 or 10 labels that are applicable to my area, and I don't see all the labels. There are around 25 or 30 labels across Microsoft. The one last thing which I want to show is, if I minimize the screen, is if you are familiar with sensitivity labels that apply to documents, then mainly you have created labels to encrypt your document, and not all the time that label is very useful in context of sites and groups. I can create labels which are common, but then I can also create labels which are specific for my emails and files, because they have different combinations of encryption and doesn't mean much in context of sites and groups. I have one such example label called files and email only. This is a label which is for user-defined permission, where you can change where the end user can change the encryption of the label. I'll show you the special part of this label. If you see the sites and group settings tab, it's empty. And what it means is, if I go quickly, it has a bunch of encryption action on it. If I go to the sites and group settings tab, it is turned off. Instead of on, it is off. Okay. The impact of this is, and we are rolling this out. This is something kind of a new item, and probably you haven't seen earlier. The impact of this is, this label is a files and email specific label and should not show in the context of team creation or SharePoint site creation, because it doesn't make sense. We have turned that slider off if you have noticed. So if I go to SharePoint, you don't see that label called files and email only. Okay, so that specific label is not present because we have done the work, infrastructure layer, to hide that label. So switching back, so that's the first part where we spoke about a quick recap of what are the things we spoke about. As an admin, you can create various combination of labels with policies. The enforcement is proactive because as soon as you create the site or the team, the label shows up, the label appears across Teams, SharePoint, Outlook, and all the major workloads. So your protection applies immediately, cross workload, managed centrally. As an end user, you don't need to worry because you keep seeing the same label, so you know it's a predictable behavior. So your learning curve for your end users are low. And then, of course, this is the biggest feedback that we got is all users are not policy experts. They don't need to understand your corporate policy. They just need to know that if you choose a general label or a confidential label or a top secret label, depending on that document or that site or that team that they're creating, everything else behind the scene will be taken care. Every other policy that the admin wants will be enforced. So if there is any quick takeaway that you want to take, that's the one that this is mainly for your end users.
Awesome. We had a couple of questions coming here, Sanjaya, around from the administrative level here. A couple questions around external access. So that privacy setting, right? that little checkbox that you're setting. Can you kind of speak? Yeah, can you speak a little bit to exactly what that does and how does that relate to any of the settings that are done in the Azure AD or M365 Admin Center as far as external access already, right? Like how does this, is there any prerequisites that need to have that to be enabled? And when that is set in, is that, what really is the impact for that for guest access versus, let's say, external access? I know when you look in the Teams world, those are also words that are used differently.
Excellent. So what it means is this one in specific. So this is an important concept, and thanks Drew and and our listeners to bring this question up. So SharePoint historically has a concept of external sharing, and we'll talk towards the end of our talk on external sharing. This control is not about SharePoint's external sharing. This control is about Office 365 group and the admin allowing the group owners to add, like sanjoyan@gmail.com or drew@gmail.com, to be added to a group or not. Okay, so, and classic example will be, if you noticed, I created just the site. I said strategy 2020. Let me see. I already created some. Oh. I'm trying to remember from top of my head, but we can quickly create a site. Let's say I create a, I quickly create a team site called, just to show that experience. What does it mean? So it's already private. The site gets created, and then the label name should show up. There's some problem in tenant, so this name takes some more time. So I think I should go here, and then if I go to my site information, the sensitivity is not applying. So wait a moment. Basically, what you should not be able to do is, if I go to my site permission and try to invite a people, okay, and say add members to group, this will not be allowed. If you try to add, once my label shows up, takes a minute or two to the sync job to work, because we are syncing this with AD, you will not be able to apply a member from someone@gmail.com. So that's the impact.
Perfect, and that's a good point. So different, it's the group level sharing that's configured. So the questions that are came through, that is where the external access is being set. And then two more for you, Sanjay, that came through. Licensing for this setting, for enabling sensitivity at the group level. is there a licensing requirement?
I think this is exact same licensing requirement that we had for AD classification that you have seen earlier as well, which is ADP1.
Okay. And the last one, the yellow bar, the notification for web-only access, is there any opportunity, is that editable at all?
Oh, you mean the text that came up in the yellow bar, is that editable? For now, no, but if there are strong feedback, I'm open to take that feedback. As of now, no. Okay, is that all?
Yeah, I mean, there's some other ones that we'll kind of kick to the end. There's a couple on migration from existing labels. I know I'd rather.
We will cover migration. Yes. Anything else?
Yeah, so we'll hold off on that other thing. Other than that, we're good.
Fine. Thanks. So I want to quickly show some of the other admin experiences or additional features that you have. So I'll quickly demo a few admin experiences, what you can see from an Office 365 Admin Center, from AD Admin Center, and auditing very quickly before we move on to the next topic. So let me go ahead and share my screen again to show you the other admin experiences. So the first one that I want to show is group creation in AD admin, because many customers, create groups via, AD admin center. So if you create a new group here, again, seamless experience. So if you choose Office 365 group, you see the new dropdown. This was not there earlier. This is there now, and you will see the list of labels. You can choose any label and create the group that you want to create. Okay. Quickly moving on to SharePoint Admin Center. I had it open somewhere. Okay, so SharePoint Admin Center, similar experience. We added a column called sensitivity against all the sites, all the group sites, classic sites. You can see the sensitivity label. What you can do is you can override the sensitivity label. For example, this one, you can select this and say, hey, I want to, I'm sorry, I selected 2. I want to select the HR announcement, go to policies. You select the sensitivity label as general, but you want to change it to something else. Let's say, no, this is a confidential one. You can do that. And you can say done. And you see the site has now become confidential. Okay, so very cool and easy to override from here. And if you are Office 365 admin or SCC admin, you can come to security and compliance, and you are very familiar with audit logs. So inside audit log, we have added a whole bunch of new auditing events for both sensitivity levels in files and SharePoint site. So if you just type for the keyword sensitivity, okay, so you'll see Power BI has recently released sensitivity level for the Power BI dashboard. So that comes up first, and then you can see sensitivity levels for sites. And then for files. So I selected applied sensitivity levels to site, and then we are logging it from SharePoint. If you go to AD admin portal and search for the logs within AD, then you will get to see all the groups that got created for the sensitivity label. You can select any operation here. Let's say I chose this one, and you will see in the modified properties section, the property that got modified when the log got generated was sensitivity label. Somebody changed the label from X to Y. Here we do not log the label name for security purposes, because the label name we consider as important data, like customer data. So we do log the ID or GUID for the label. Okay, the question comes up, and I get this all the time when I show this, is hey, how am I supposed to know what does this GUID mean? Because it doesn't mean anything because you guys don't show the name. So the other way to quickly go and check the names is if you go ahead and, so this is my tenant that I'm using, Contours Energy user 31, but for your tenant or any tenant that you're working with, your tenant name.sharepoint.com, and I have this in my deck, so you can refer this, you don't need to memorize this. SharePoint.com API group site manager, create group site, get groups creation context. If you run this, you will get back the list of labels that are there with their corresponding GUIDs. Okay, so this is a easy way to know the like I would say a programmatic or an API driven way to know the labels that are there, what are their IDs, and what are their properties. And this is also used heavily by our ISV and developer communities, because they need to get the list of labels. This is the easy way to reach that. Just looking at my notes, if I have covered everything. Cool. Okay, I think I did. Switching to my deck. So we showed you can track teams that got created with different labels from all the admin centers. Labels can be overridden. We changed the label from one of the site very easily. You can apply labels via PowerShell. Oh, I missed that. So let's see. It's very easy. I'm trying to drag and drop my screen here. So I assigned into my tenant, which is Contours Energy 31 as admin. And the construct that you should do is set SPO site identity, and whatever URL is there for the site, you can do that. And then you can set the sensitivity label by knowing the GUID of the sensitivity label. So if you know the GUID, you can apply the GUID. So admin can do that. We have other advanced syntax if you want to apply labels to not one site, but a whole bunch of sites. You can do that. And I have experiences coming up for developers where developer wants to apply not only for SharePoint, but for groups. So I'll show that real quick. So in terms of developer experience, the first thing which I repeated was, hey, as a developer, how do I know what are the labels that are available? What are the GUIDs and IDs and properties, etc.? The syntax for that is there. All this will be in our documentation when we GA, and we'll talk about GA towards the end of our presentation. The second example, which I already show, is, hey, how can I set labels to SharePoint site collections using, and any site collection for that matter, I would like to mention. If you have OneDrive, OneDrive is just a site collection for SharePoint. So if you have the URL for the OneDrive, you can do the same thing, set SPO site, URL of your OneDrive sensitivity label, and then GUID. And even Teams connected SharePoint sites, groups connected SharePoint site, or classic SharePoint site, doesn't matter. Any SharePoint site you can apply label. If you want to do this in a more API-driven way, supported using SharePoint APIs, so you probably are familiar with SharePoint APIs, your site's URL underscore API site. Then the new syntax is sensitivity label info, and you give the display name. It returns back in JSON format the display name of the label, or you can do the ID. It returns back the GUID of a specific site, the site URL that you give. If you want to set it programmatically, then you need to send a patch request. If you're familiar with MS Graph APIs, you would know what is patch request, and you can send the GUID of the new label and make a patch request, and you can do it. You can play with this in the MS Graph API console. As an Office 365 developer, and I get this question many times, so I had a slide for this one in specific. What about groups? Because I showed everything which is very SharePoint specific. What about groups? So in case of groups, you would be able to create groups like this. This is a classic syntax till here, because you are just creating a unified group with a display name, and you generally give an alias to the group. Now you should be able to do a dash sensitivity label ID and give the GUID of the label. So during group creation itself, you attach the label programmatically A. And then for an existing group, if you want to change the label to a new label, or if an existing group, an old group you had with no label, you want to assign a label, then set unified group. You give the handle of the group, and then assign the GUID of the group. All the documentations for MS Graph is documented here. Please take a look. All these are public documentation available out. Plus, this deck has the details. So please, I encourage you to go ahead and play with these. So I'll move a little quickly on interest of time, because this is an important topic. The next, so we saw earlier general admin experience, end user experience, specific policies, importance of that, proactive application of policies versus reactive. All those are goodness. Developers, how their life will be, how they can automate several things, which now they're doing in a slightly different way, perhaps. Migration. It's very important to understand, because previously labels were authored in specifically classifications in relation to groups were authored in AD, where PowerShell, it used to be called classification list. That thing has changed. Okay, we now have the new sensitivity label, and it is authored in Security and Compliance Center. Okay, so if you have bad jobs, automations, and things that you are reading and making some business decisions, then those things needs to be rethought through. Okay, so I get a common set of questions, and I try to capture that, and I'll talk through that and take questions. So the first one is, people commonly ask me, hey, what happens to my old classification? Are they getting deprecated? So no, the answer is they're not getting deprecated. Sensitivity label and classifications can coexist if you want to. But sensitivity label for now is an opt-in feature. You should read the documentation. The documentation is here. If you read the documentation, you will know the switch that will enable you to turn this on, and you can turn it back off at any point in time if you do not want to keep the feature. And both the things can coexist if you want to, but I do not recommend that. There are some pitfalls, and it's covered more details. So the second question, which I spoke about earlier in summary, is, hey, I have a whole bunch of old groups or sites that I created over the years using a old AD classification. What happens to that? So we provided a sample script that you need to run manually, but it's a one-time, and if you run those, then those groups can be kind of converted, if I can say, to new sensitivity labels. But you need to do a mapping, because that was like a text-based field. This has GUID ID and has a meaning. So there are two different fields. So you need to have a mapping that if a group used to be called as, I would say, general or something, then now the corresponding label ID in the new world is ABC. So you need to do the mapping when you need to, and run a loop basically. Okay, all these samples are in this document. So there are a whole bunch of new scenarios that we know that you will face are covered here. Another thing I would like to mention, which I have covered in the documentation but not in the deck, is the workloads who support sensitivity labels. The primary workload who supports sensitivity labels end-to-end is Teams, SharePoint, and Outlook, or Outlook Web Access, and Outlook clients as well. For Outlook clients that run on your desktop, you need to onboard to the newer clients. So if you are in a monthly channel or insider, you will get all the latest faster. If you are old, you will still be able to use sensitivity labels with some limitations. And again, we covered the limitations here. Do read that. If you are heavy on using other workloads than the ones that I mentioned, for example, customers do use Yammer or Planner or Project. These haven't yet transitioned into using the new sensitivity labels. They still point to the old AD classification. So you need to be aware if you are making the transition right now, and then what are our recommendations till the time these apps 100% support sensitivity labels, and how do we recommend you to manage your tenant having some workloads not supporting sensitivity labels end to end. Yammer, Planner, and Project, mainly these three. Okay. So I highly recommend, do download the document and then give a read. Do download. Do take a look at the limitations that are there. I think few people asked about licensing. So licensing is straightforward. In order to create a label, you need Microsoft 365 E3, Office 365 E3 or above. Some features need, not all features, some features need ADP2, but in generally you need ADP1. For conditional access, I think it used to need P2 and now it needs P1. So do play around with that, okay, and you will understand. In general, this all applies to label creation. Once you create the label and distribute, then in order to consume the label, okay, the requirement is pretty straightforward.
So yeah, so I think that's really good. So there were the questions that came through. To kind of summarize, if you were using the existing classification through AD, the text-based classification, there is a script which I have ran. It's good, it works, and it does let you convert with the mapping to say if your site was confidential today, you put in you get the GUID for the new confidential, and you can convert your existing sites. Another good question is, if you are not using that and you enable sensitivity and you never enabled the AD classification and you want to start using sensitivity classifications for sites, sensitivity labels for sites tomorrow, let's say, and you enable it, what would be their user experience then to go back? What would be some other options then to go back and label their existing sites as there wouldn't be a conversion?
That's a good one, Drew. So there's a challenge there because previously there was no classification. So there is no hook or tag to tell what kind of data that site or team holds. So in that case, you might need to, as an admin, you might need to talk to your user to find out on a one-to-one basis. There's no
Yeah, exactly. So to me, and for any customer, I haven't had a customer in that situation yet, but if they did ask me, the approach I would take is you can, Sanjoyan showed all of the cool reports you can get to see stuff. What you can do, and you'll be in the admin center, you build a change management process around that to say, hey, you have 30 days to go classify your site. Here's the new classifications that we have for the site. That's the new sensitivity labels, I should say, and go classify it. And then as an admin, you can say, hey, it's been 7 days. You still haven't done anything yet. Please go classify. Like, you can still put the onus back on the user to go classify it. Now, in that same vein, another one there, what if a user changes the classification to something that's higher or lower? Is there justification, or what is kind of done for changing sensitivity of labels for sites back and forth? Because they're not locked in, right? I should say the assumption. You cannot lock in a sensitivity label on a site and say it can never be changed.
So the question is, let's say if I go to my SharePoint homepage, you see this got reflected now and this comes. So this takes a couple of minutes. So as soon as my tab loads, the question, Drew, is, if I understand, if I go to, so I'm the owner of the site, I go to site information, and then I can see the label, sensitivity label.
And you change this to
I'd
public,
like to,
right?
For example, downgrade, we call this, from confidential to general. Can I do that? The answer is yes, you can do that. The question that you asked is very good, which is, hey, if I downgrade, what are the ways that an admin can know that you are downgrading? So the first way to know is to go to the audit log to see that, hey, somebody changed from an old label to a new label. Here, unlike documents, if you are familiar with sensitivity label and documents, we ask for a downgrade justification. We don't have that yet, but we definitely do plan the downgrade justification down the line. That the owner needs to mention why did he downgrade, so the onus is on the owner.
Yep. No, that's awesome. That makes sense.
Okay, and then roadmap. So we have, perfect. We have 5 more minutes to go. So this feature in specific will GA sometime in June, which is super close now, almost end of May. So we are very close to GAing. I again highly recommend the link to the limitations and apps that we support, migration, etc. are all there in this deck that Vlad and Drew is going to send out. Do spend some time in planning, understanding the product, and playing with it, but will be 100% available worldwide for your consumption. The few things that we consider are important based on feedback that we got from customers are on my right-hand side box, which we would like to cover through this year, through December, this calendar year. One of them is, and I'll show a quick demo, we have time, a very, very quick demo on MFA. So we are supporting, to extend what Drew said earlier, that we are extending the control of conditional access from unmanaged devices per site to even more. We are telling, hey, currently, if you have seen, we are blocking access. You can potentially block access from an unmanaged device to a given site. In some cases, you can say that if I know that Sanjoyan is Sanjoyan, if I can make sure by asking a secondary question, by sending him a text message, and then he enters a PIN, and I'm now sure that Sanjaya is trying to actually open the site, I will let him proceed using an MFA, or we call step-up authentication. So this is something which we are considering using sensitivity labels. The second one, and I think somebody asked the question, and it's very important to understand, even if we currently using sensitivity labels, we do not prevent people from sharing content externally, because external sharing is a very SharePoint specific construct. And even if the site is marked as confidential and you don't add guests to the group, you can still go and right click on a document and share it with externally if SharePoint external sharing is turned on. This is something which we are bridging the gap, and many people told us that this, hey, this is a security hole, because it is kind of misleading that you are telling I'm creating a confidential group where owner cannot add a guest, but then you can find a roundabout way to still share content externally. And we acknowledge that. So we are bringing the construct of external sharing on the labels itself. The third one that I showed you a sneak peek is complete separation of labels that are used for documents and emails and sites and groups. So you will be able to declaratively tell that, hey, these are my documents specific labels that make sense for emails and documents, versus these only make sense for sites and groups. I have some big customers who clearly wants this separation, okay, because some labels don't apply in case of sites, teams, and groups. The last one is very interesting, and we have heard many customers asking us in preview, and probably you would be able to relate as well to the listeners, is, hey, let's say I have a label that has an encryption on it. I want to apply the label on a SharePoint site. I drag and drop a document on the SharePoint site, or upload a document to the SharePoint site. That document, without any other user interaction, will get or inherit, if I can use that word, from the site, which means if I now right click on the document and download the document from SharePoint, it will get that same top secret or confidential label with the same encryption settings that is on it. So we are working on that scenario as well. So these are the four basic operations, and we are on top of the hour. So I don't want to take any more time and stop here and take.
So I had two things that kind of came through the last one. I was definitely I knew we had 4 coming on there, but from a question of inheritance, I know that's a big one that I see. But in general, around encryption, in downsides of encryption, as it potentially would relate, I mean, it's a little bit more of a higher level. In you had all of your labels and you marked them all as encryption, especially when it relates to files hosted in Office in Microsoft 365, or if you enable those for sites and groups. Just any words on how encryption relates to some of the conversation we've had today for files, and actually if you built a label, had it for sites and groups, and then kind of had multiple things marked as encrypted.
So
or even just,
let's take this example real quick. So this site is marked as confidential, has some encryption settings on it. But from a site standpoint, I can upload, I just created this site, right, during the demo. I can upload a bunch of documents. These documents won't inherit the label called confidential. You have to manually add the labels to the document, okay, for now. And then the option 4 that I showed in my deck is where we are considering that if I would have created a new document or uploaded a document, this confidential site, as an admin, you can probably have a way to mention that any document uploaded to this site by default will become confidential. So at present, no relationship between labels that apply to a site and encryption, but in near future, we probably will provide a way to have that.
From a customer standpoint, are you seeing more customers now enabling encryption for all of their for multiple labels, or are you seeing more consistent? They have 1 or 2 labels, or 1 label that uses encryption, and then the other ones are used more for visual indicators. I guess, what have you been seeing from a customer standpoint for that?
So in general, and within Microsoft and outside, I speak with many customers day to day. Generally, they create labels and combination of policies with encryption depending on the scenario. But the number stays between 5 to 15, and I don't see an explosion of labels getting created, mainly depending on large organization having some complexity. And then there are scenarios where, hey, I want to create a label and I want only people from this project, like these 3 guys, and I know the project is going to get over in 6 months, so that label will be of no meaning. In those cases, the customers use what we call as user-defined permissions, where the admin creates a label where the encryption action or gesture will depend at the time of applying the label to a specific document. So if I am using that label, I need to choose who I need to apply with. So then that label is reused across specific specialized scenarios instead of increasing the count of labels or explosion of labels.
So you're seeing, so to summarize, you're still seeing a mix. You're not seeing people doing, like at Microsoft, you don't have everyone that is using encryption. You have specific scenarios where you want to enable encryption because there can be downsides if you just had all of your content, everything encrypted everywhere. And the drawback could be you have confusion or lack of understanding with the users, or if the labels are too tight that they might start breaking out collaboration with other customers or clients or whatever you're working with, right?
Exactly, you're right. So they understand that, and again, only we see less than 2% of all the files that are there in SharePoint and OneDrive having encryption on it, because it's a powerful operation, needs to be used judiciously, and only to protect files that needs that protection, and not all files. Like, there is no need to apply encryption on every other file that you create. Only when you need, you apply protection. Yes, you might use content marking for headers, footers, and watermark. And that's, many customers do that. But as you said, no customers turn on encryption as default for all documents.
And definitely, and now with all the Content Explorer and Activity Explorer, a lot of so to kind of wrap it up here, it's also the concepts of information data classification are not, you don't want to approach this as a technical conversation first. When I do engagements around information classification, I would say the heavy majority of the time is working with different parts of the business to understand what classifications you really need. So a question came through around law firms, right? What do we see, have they been used? To me, not that much different than other organizations use them, unless you had potentially material or client information that you wanted to maybe build your own label for. But everyone, whatever organization you're in, and even especially law firms, you're going to be at the same type of risk, data breach risk, whether it's from insider or malicious or accidental, for content that can be exposed. And the information classification scheme that you build, I normally see public, confidential, highly confidential, or sensitive, highly sensitive, secret, top secret, public. I mean, generic terms that I worked with one customer who did colors. We had red, yellow, orange, a red, yellow, green. It's okay, but those are dependent on you understanding what class sensitivity labels make sense to your organization and how they work together. And then you look at what the controls can do. Don't approach this and say, I need to be able to encrypt a piece, or I need to be able to not share something. So I want to do this, enable, add a label and call it like to not to be shared. Right? That doesn't necessarily provide the same type of context as you would as a bigger picture data classification strategy. And your data is not just for files, it now can include the containers of those files too. So it updates your strategy, it doesn't prohibit it. So for the people asking kind of where and why that fits in, or how these fits in, is think about it at your organizational level with different business units, different teams, whoever you, different products, projects, however, and then your site classification along with your file classification can adapt to that strategy. So we're not as limited just saying, here are your 4 labels, that's all you get only on these types of files. Now we're thinking of content more holistically, and you can start to bring them together. And I think one of the cool things that not many people have seen that we're seeing now is, Sanjaya, one of your first demos of having labels just for files, labels just for sites, labels for certain people in an organization, you can really start to mix and match and tell the same story through classification.
You are right. Absolutely. Yes.
So definitely went a few minutes over. Thanks for everyone who did kind of stay. So we will get this out for everyone who is on, still hung out to the end. Our next webinar is planned right now for June 16th. And we will probably have this topic come up a little bit because we'll actually be talking to, on the Microsoft side, we'll be bringing in people on the Microsoft 365 groups team to talk about kind of what's new and what's coming for groups. And this will just be one of the features that we know are coming, but obviously not as much of a deep dive. So for for everyone, Vlad, obviously, thanks for hosting these with me, and Sanjoyan, thanks very much for joining us on this grid webinar today. This is great stuff.
My pleasure. Thanks, Vlad. Thanks everyone who stayed.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great week.
Bye-bye.